WWCs.
Welcome back to the Corporate Culture Protest, the space where we dismantle toxic norms and push for workplaces that value people, not just profits. I'm Arika, your wellness advocate, and today we're diving into a topic that makes employees everywhere nervous: disciplinaries and dismissals. To help us unpack this, we're joined by a special guest, Stephen Sachs, an experienced labor lawyer who has seen it all when it comes to workplace disputes. I will also be joined by my amazing co-hosts, Jenna and Dr. Chippo. Jenna will be leading most of today's questions, so let's get started. Over to you, Jenna.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Dr. Chipa, for being here. And to our guest, Stephen Sachs, thank you so much for being here. How are you, Steve?
I'm good, thank you. And thank you for having me on today. As I mentioned earlier, this is a very complex topic, so hopefully we'll be able to give you some insights that are going to be valuable for both employees and employers.
No, we are all really grateful. Thank you so much, Steve. You know, this topic is something I think about a lot in terms of my experience of doing employee wellness, and not just the dismissals themselves, but how the process that happens and what happens leading up to the dismissal itself in terms of what do managers identify, what do they see and not see, why are they so frequent, etc. So this is what we want to tap into today. So many employees, they don't know their rights at all or how the law protects them. So what we want to start off, Steve, is with the basics. To start off with, what are some of the key things both employees and employers should know about disciplinaries and dismissals as a kind of foundation? What should they know or to be aware of where, as in terms of how the process starts, what they need to be aware of regarding dismissals and disciplinaries?
Okay, so as I mentioned, it's a complex area. I'm going to go back a little bit, if I may, and just explain what an employment relationship is. Primarily, it's a contract between an employer and an employee, and both parties have to deliver on that contract. They both have obligations, and I'm not sure that both parties always understand that kind of relationship, that it's a contract and you both have to deliver. And really what's happening in a nutshell is that the employer is buying your time and expertise as an employee, and the employee is selling his or her time and expertise to the employer. And both parties need to respect each other. I think this is the nub of where your podcast sits. It's a two-way street. It often doesn't work that way, though. But if both parties can respect each other and talk to each other and communicate properly, you'd avoid a lot of issues. There's often an imbalance in power between an employer and an employee, where generally it's regarded that the employer's in the driving seat. This can have sometimes some awkward or unfavorable consequences for an employee. And you know, if employees are feeling disrespected or left out, communication and consultation is key. So the relationship is often fragile. Communication, as I said, is key. And a very interesting point. It's interesting that employers often have exit interviews when somebody leaves. But they fail to have interviews during the employment period. That would be far more useful, and you'd get more insight into what's happening on the ground and in terms of that relationship if both parties spoke to each other during the period of employment rather than during the process of some disciplinary process or dismissal.
And that for me is the hub of what today is about. The fact that, because you've mentioned the word communication a few times. So there's no communication, there's nothing happening in the process, interviews, it's all quiet, and then there's the disciplinary, and then there's the exit interview. So in terms of your experience as a starting point to this chat, is that what you've noticed generally, is that there's a culture of management and employees not speaking. It's toxic. It's a top-down approach. Um, that fosters this culture of fear. And then the next thing that happens is suddenly you've got a disciplinary, and there was no communication in the interim. Is that what you've noticed from your experience?
Yes, definitely. And
Yeah.
the thing is that I think there's some statistics that are published on an annual
Mm.
basis as to who's the best employer in the country. You've
Yeah.
probably seen those things. Um, those are, call it the top 10, and that's it. You don't hear
Yeah.
about the hundreds and thousands of other employers who
Yeah.
are generally maybe small businesses or smaller businesses and
Yeah.
who lack the skill in
Mm.
making sure that your employees are actually your partners in your business. They're a big stakeholder in the business. And
Yeah.
a lot of employers, I don't think, see them as stakeholders or partners in the business. They just see them as workers.
Okay. So it's how these managers see these employees, that you're just there as a sort of cog on a wheel. You're just there to contribute, and that's your job. They don't see them, as you say, they don't see they don't see their humanity. And along with that, Dr. Chipo, in aligning with
Yes.
what Stephen's saying, dismissals often reveal deeper cultural issues in organizations, not just individual mistakes. And sometimes managers don't see this, or it's it's just the employee's badly behaved or that kind of thing, and then it's all on the employee. What have you noticed in terms of broader cultural systemic issues in organizations?
Okay, so thank you so much, Jenna, and thank you so much, Steve, for your insightful contribution that you've just given us. I think with the institutional culture and organizational culture, then you find that it's something then that's very deeply rooted on how the system then operates. Because like Steve mentioned that employees are very central, they're key in the
Mm.
functioning of the company, right? But
Yeah,
oftentimes you find that power imbalance, that power dynamic then ends up
mm,
shifting all the focus and all the attention to the employer to a point where it ends up being a situation where it feels and seems as if the employer holds all the power in the relationship. And you
yeah,
find that when then that happens, we have a situation where now employees are always under the constant pressure and always under the constant impression that they have to perform and always perform. And then there's somebody looking, there's that element of always looking over your shoulder, because now, if then we don't have proper communication to say that it's contractual, we're both contributing, it's a give and take, we end up in a situation where the power imbalance works against the employees, and
ah,
that in essence then ends up creating that situation that we've spoken about over the weeks, to say there's that culture of toxicity that gets reinforced in the workplace to a point where it's normalized, and we get to a point where
ah,
employees then feel defenseless to stand up for themselves, to say this is not working, this cannot work in my favor, this is creating a hostile environment for me. But because of those fears as well that come with those threats of dismissal and disciplinary action being taken against employees, you find that we end up with a scale that is not balanced at the end of the day, and it always works against the employees. That's what I've noticed over the years when you're looking at organizational culture and institutional culture, and
mm.
how then management tends to respond and relates with the employees.
Yeah, and what I'm picking up so far from both of your answers is this power imbalance. And so with this in mind, then, Steve, how can employees avoid disciplinaries and dismissals in the first place? Are there proactive steps that they can take? What can they do?
So perhaps it's best to look at how does an employee a disciplinary take place in the first place, and
Okay.
what the kind of disciplinaries can be. And to start off with, I'm going to just quickly touch on the types of dismissals that can take place.
Okay.
There's basically three kinds of dismissals. It can be a dismissal for misconduct. Misconduct can be, and maybe I'll go into those issues just now, but it can be things like fraud, insubordination, which is where employees refuse or fail to follow instructions of the employer.
Yeah.
It could be timekeeping infractions. It could be all sorts of things like that. The second one is on an incapacity basis, and that's really broken down into two possible scenarios. The first one is where there might be a medical incapacity, where an employee is physically unable to continue doing the job that they were doing. For example, they may have fallen ill, they may have had a car accident, they may be disabled in some way, and then there are certain requirements in terms of how an employer has to deal with that if they want to, let's call it, terminate or dismiss the employee. There are other requirements as well on how you can possibly accommodate those employees, but take it at that. The second incapacity thing is where a person just doesn't have the capacity to do the job. So, for example, if you took a blue-collar worker and you tried to make them the financial director and they have no financial skills, they're going to have an incapacity to do that job. And if the person is, I know it's not a performance-related thing. To a degree, it's performance-related, but they're unable to do the job. And then the third kind of dismissal is for operational requirements, which is commonly known as retrenchments. And that may be where a business is restructuring, and that may not necessarily be for financial reasons. It may be they just haven't had time to restructure and they're now re-looking at their business. So those are the three principal areas: misconduct, incapacity, and operational requirements. The biggest thing, and this is where employees and employers both trip up and probably don't understand their rights fully, and that dismissals should be fair. They've got to be both procedurally and substantively fair. Now, those are two big words, but the procedure is really how the disciplinary process takes place. In other words, was a hearing held? Were the guys allowed to state their case, and so on? And then substance is the reason why. Why are we terminating this person in the first place? Is it because of fraud? Is it because of insolence? Is it because of insubordination, and so on? So in order to be fair, an employee must be able to answer the case against them. And I think a lot of employees are called into disciplinaries. You asked, how do they avoid this? They're called into disciplinaries and they don't actually understand what they have to answer to. So they're entitled to a fair and clear allegation that's been made against them that they can understand and answer. It's not a criminal case, so it doesn't have to be in absolute finite terms, but the employee needs to know what case do they have to answer to. It doesn't have to be perfectly worded, just so that they can prepare and come to the hearing, state their case, and have a fair opportunity to put their side of the story forward. The same applies, of course, to the company, that they've got to put their side of the story forward and they've got to bring their proof. And it's crazy that so often we find that companies are falling short on the procedure, not so much the substance. The substance, remember, is the why. Procedure is the how, because they just do not follow the proper procedure. And then they get taken out of the CCMA and they wonder why. So it's important that the company follows proper procedures as well.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing there is misinformed as to process and how to go about this. Okay, so we were chatting the other day, Stephen, and you brought up that new laws are coming in place. So what are these new laws regarding dismissals that workers and managers need to be aware of? Are there changes happening?
So yes, there was a government gazette that published the new code of good practice on dismissals, which was published last month, in fact. The old code goes back many, many, many years. And what this new code encompasses now are a couple of important pointers, and I'll just point out a few of them. First of all, the process has actually become simpler for employers, which does make it a little bit more complex for employees. But what the process now has to be is that the code looks at the size of the business. So if you're a small operation then you don't have to comply fully with all these complex processes and procedures. And the process can be tailored to suit your environment. You might be a one-man show employing 2 or 3 people, or even a slightly bigger operation, but you don't have a human resources department. So you kind of handle everything internally. You don't necessarily know how to follow the proper procedures. It still needs to be a fair process, though. And that's very important. So there still has to be a fair process where the employee is asked to answer a case and that the employee is, most importantly, given a chance to answer the case and to put their side of the story forward. Following on from that, it's important that and employees need to understand this, that there's a principle called progressive discipline. What does that mean? That means, and I'll just take late coming because it's a simple one, that if you come late to work on the first occasion, it's a little bit onerous or steep if you get dismissed on your first late coming.
Sure.
So then you would get a written warning, and then a second warning, and then a third warning, and then go to a disciplinary because you just are not cooperating. So one needs to look at progressive discipline, which is a series of processes where the employer tries to guide the employee and correct the behavior. The employer, okay, and this is another one that's very important, is that the employer needs to be consistent in the discipline. You can't just take one employee and apply or dismiss them for something when you haven't done the same to another employee who committed a similar offense. So it's very important that there's consistency, and a lot of employees don't pick up on this, and they should. They should say, well, you never dismissed my colleague and they committed a similar offense. So they need to be consistent.
So what I'm hearing from this, Steve, what I'm hearing from this, just to chip in, what I'm hearing from this is that employers have to document each time they discipline a person. They can't just be quiet and then suddenly dismiss someone. There has to be proof or a sort of track record or a paper trail of examples when they called them in and examples of efforts that they made to fix the relationship. Am I hearing you right?
You're hearing me right, but that works both ways, because it's not only the employer that's obliged to do that. The employee should also keep a record of interactions with the employer where they may have said, look, I'm not coping with this job, or I don't have enough time to do it and the resources are not sufficient, or I need more training. There could be many things where an employee sits drowning or not coping in the job, and they don't communicate this with the employer. So it's important for an employee to communicate that with the employer, and preferably keep a record, keep something in writing. If you are going to email, keep a record of all those emails so that you can then refer back to those if push comes to shove at a later stage.
Well, this actually leads
one
me to
other important thing.
Okay, Karen.
If I could just finish that. One of the new things that's come out in this code of conduct is that there's a new definition that's been brought in where there's a possibility of an incompatibility between an employee and an employer, and employees need to understand this. So if you, in the old days, or prior to this new code of conduct being gazetted, there was no such thing as incompatibility, but they've brought this concept in. What that means now is that if you generally are not getting on with your colleagues, and this happens often, that you could be accused of incompatibility and be terminated for that reason. It remains to be seen how this is going to play out, because there's obviously no court cases at this point in time. It's going to, as I say, remain to be seen how that works in practice, because it's a new definition. But employees should just be careful where they're disruptive in the workplace, where they are a noisemaker or a troublemaker in the workplace. The employer is quite in their right to now say that there's an incompatibility between you and us, and we're going to terminate your services on that basis.
Wow. Goodness. So then, I mean, that conveniently leads me to my next question then. Do you see a disconnect then between management and employees that leads to so many dismissals? Is it because that there's been a lack of communication or a lack of documenting of issues, or employees not going to employers and saying, I need more training on this, or vice versa, I need you to do this as well. Is there a strong case for that? So a disconnect between management and employees, which are leading to dismissals?
Absolutely. I think employees sit back, and as I mentioned before, they don't give feedback sufficiently to the employer as to what's happening, some of the problems they've got. There's a very interesting program that is on TV sometimes. It's an American program. And what they do is it's a program where the boss goes down onto the factory floor, or did one in McDonald's or Wendy's burgers or something, and they go down and they go undercover. It's called Undercover Boss. And it's amazing what bosses can learn from their employees about their own business. They think they know everything, but they don't. But coming back to the point, all too often, employees don't give feedback because they are weary of the bosses, and that's where the disconnect comes.
Yeah, but Steve, it's also maybe significant or symbolic, and also to bring you in, Dr. Chibia, of an environment. On the one hand, employees might feel afraid to speak up because they're afraid, so they don't speak up, and now they don't say what they want. On the other hand, is it not the company's role to introduce training programs in the first place? That's what I mean by this disconnect. Whose role is it to be? It's both roles to be proactive. But do you see where I'm going with this, Steve? Whose role is it to do the mentorship?
The responsibility really falls back on both. I think that employees have value that they can add to the company, and all too often they don't speak about that value that they can add. Obviously, the employer knows what they want out of their employees, and I'm sure that Dr. Chipo would back me up on this when I say that if they just spoke to each other more about the strengths and weaknesses, that the business has, that the employees have, that their colleagues have, ultimately the responsibility falls back on the company, probably to facilitate something like this. But I think it's a two-way street.
Dr. Chipa, your thoughts?
No, Steve, you're right, and Jenna, you're right. It all boils down to communication. So if then there's that breakdown in communication, then a moment that happens where the power dynamic, that lack of maybe respect, if I can put it that way, goes away to a point where then one party might feel like they are in a position where they are incapacitated to stand up and speak or make contributions. I think we had a conversation about this a couple of episodes back, to say sometimes it's also because of the environment, or how there tends to be a situation where a toxic environment gets created in the workspace that then ends up creating a situation where employees might feel like they cannot speak up, they cannot communicate, or they cannot contribute because of the kind of relationship that ends up being established over time. So if we get into a situation where maybe bullying of employees becomes a thing, nobody calls anybody out for that, it becomes normalized to a point where, because employees sometimes are also scared of their job security, they'll end up becoming silenced and become very quiet and not be in a position where they can stand up to say or question or to make demands to say this needs to happen, or we are not comfortable, this is creating hostility in the workplace, therefore we are not being productive at the maximum that we can be. So I think you're right, and I think it's very important then to keep that line of communication open, to make it clear and constantly remind each other of the value that we are bringing to the table for the company. Because at the end of the day, nothing functions if employees are not working at their optimum best. And at the same time, they also need to work in an environment that allows them to thrive as employees. So if then we end up in a situation where toxicity continues to be the order of the day, there is that elimination of an environment where we are free enough to be as productive as we should be and what we are bringing to the table, the value decreases if then job satisfaction goes down.
Yeah, spot on, man. So then on that, then Steve, on that, from your experience, I'll ask a kind of two-parted question. On the one hand, what are the most common reasons for dismissals that you've seen? And do certain leadership styles like authoritarian, macromanaging leadership styles increase the risk of these dismissals? So kind of a two-parted question, but what have you noticed from those two?
So the first thing is, as I mentioned, that misconduct is the prime reason for dismissals. And within misconduct, there is this concept of insubordination, which comes up more often than not. And what is insubordination? It's really where an employee doesn't listen to instructions or is obstructive in the workplace. And my advice to employees and employers, I suppose, is don't be obstructive in the process. Try and work together. If a reasonable request is made of an employee, that employee should make every effort to cooperate and to carry out that request. I think all too often, employees often ask their employers for favors, whether it might be time off, it might be a loan, it might be something else like that. But then when the employer asks for something, the employees are often reluctant. And they've got family commitments or whatever the case may be. But it's just, I mentioned it right in the beginning, this is a give and take. It's a two-way street. So insubordination is one big one. Theft and fraud is more and more on the up and up, unfortunately. And that is also a common reason for dismissals. And then probably the third most common reason is retrenchment. Now, just related to those, you asked the question, is there anything management could do to avoid those? Well, we've kind of touched on it in terms of keeping the communication lines open, and management need to be a little bit sensitive to employees. They also, and one of the important things is these disciplinary hearings and potential dismissals or retrenchments are traumatic for employees.
I wanted to get into, Steve, the human impact of this, and bring Eric in here as well. I mean, what to bring you in here, in terms of the psychological impact. Now, I wanted to start with Erica first. From your side, Erica, what is the human impact of this, and from what you've seen from your experiences in terms of the psychological impact on how this is dealt with?
Well, for me, what I've noticed is there's a lot of unfair labor practices in the corporate environment. However, lots of people are too afraid to speak up because they don't want to lose their jobs. And this is the common theme, the silence. They'd rather not say anything and hold on to their jobs. They'll accept the unfair treatment, accept the victimization. So for me, I find this aspect to be horrifying, because you signed a contract to do a job. That's all you did. You didn't sign up to be victimized or ridiculed. So it's a very difficult situation.
Yeah. So Steve, then how do we move, in aligning with what Eric is saying, how do we move from a culture of punishment to a culture of fairness and accountability?
Well, it's really, again, as I said, it's the desire of both parties to want to work together and to both contribute. When there's a dismissal, as we mentioned, it's traumatic for these employees and their families, and whatever the fallout is huge, but it's also disruptive to the company. So companies are not necessarily out there to just dismiss people all the time. What they're trying to do is they also have a business to run. If they dismiss somebody, they've got a gap and they need to train new staff and all that sort of thing. But they can only be tolerant up to a point, I suppose. They also need to prove something. Just to touch on one aspect, I have a lot of individuals who claim that they've been what we call constructively dismissed, and it's probably worth touching on that. It's probably a whole other podcast on its own. But just to touch on it, what is it? It's a constructive dismissal is really a situation where continuing the employment relationship becomes intolerable for the employee, but that intolerability is caused by the employer. So, for example, things like sexual harassment, it's a prime example. If the employee doesn't bring that to the attention of the employer, who can then try and do something about it, the employee can't then claim constructive dismissal. The employees need to have raised a formal grievance, and there's again another whole podcast on its own. So how do we avoid these things? How do we avoid dismissals? There's a culture. There needs to be a culture reset in these organizations. Often you find people from different cultures. I think Dr. Chippo touched on it. People from different cultures working together. You don't choose your colleagues when you go to work for a company. You choose the company, but you don't know who you're going to end up working with. And often this creates some friction between the relevant people who work in there. There might be hundreds of people working in an organization. And we've all got different cultures, beliefs, tolerances, and attitudes. And if we can learn to be more tolerant with each other, more understanding with each other, more understanding of the needs and requirements of the employer, of the employee, you'll definitely avoid disciplinaries and dismissals. But it's hard work.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I mean, goodness, as you say, Steve, there's many podcasts we can have on this, and we've scratched the surface, but yet covered so much. So, Steve, once again, we are so grateful that you've come on. Arika, thank you again and Dr. Chipo as well for your contributions, because of this topic is so nuanced and involved. But I will say that there is a conference next week on bullying taking place in workplaces, which means it's a really big issue. So it is high time that this issue gets dealt with. So once again, Steve, thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing all your ideas on dismissals and how this can happen. So much was shared on breakdowns in communication and power dynamics. Dr. Chipo, thank you as well. And we hope we can have you back soon. So Dr. Chipo, thank you very much. Arika, thank you very much. And Steve, thank you for being a guest today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Steve. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Have a wonderful afternoon. Yeah. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
More the lyrics is